The rain in Atlanta didn't just fall that night. It hammered down like the sky itself was weeping. Shayla stood on the wet pavement outside the house she'd called home for 3 years, her hands trembling as they cradled her swollen belly. The door had just slammed in her face, not by a stranger, by her husband, by the man whose dreams she'd funded with her own 2 hands. Hello, friends. Welcome to Black Bite Stories. Before we begin today's story, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? We love hearing from our global family. Marcus had thrown her out like garbage. His exact words still rang in her ears like a death sentence. I don't need you or that baby. You were useful when I had nothing. Now you're just in the way. The woman standing beside him, draped in designer clothes and dripping with entitlement, had laughed. A cold, glass-shattering laugh. That woman's name was Vanessa. She was the daughter of Marcus's biggest client, and apparently she was his future. Shayla stumbled down the empty street, the rain soaking through her thin dress in seconds. She had no family left. Her mother had passed when she was 19. Her father, a year later, broken by grief and debt. She had no friends anymore either. Marcus had made sure of that. He'd pulled her so deep into his world that her old life had vanished like smoke. Now she was alone, pregnant, homeless, and the cramps in her belly were getting worse. She walked for what felt like hours, her cheap sandals slapping against the flooded sidewalk. Every step was agony. Her vision blurred. The street lights became halos of light, fuzzy and distant. She leaned against a brick wall, gasping for air, her hands pressed against her stomach. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. A warm wetness spread between her legs, and it wasn't just rain. Panic clawed at her throat. Not now. Not my baby. Please, God, not my baby. That's when the headlights slowed. A sleek black Range Rover pulled up beside her, and the passenger door opened. A man stepped out, tall and dressed in a sharp suit, holding a large black umbrella. His face was kind. His eyes were worried. "Ma'am, are you okay?" he asked, his voice deep and steady. "You shouldn't be out here like this." Shayla tried to answer, but the words wouldn't come. Another wave of pain tore through her, and her knees buckled. The man moved fast, catching her before she hit the ground. His arm was solid, steady, safe. "I've got you," he said quietly. "Let's get you out of this rain." She looked up at him through the haze of pain and fear. She didn't know him, but his eyes held something she hadn't seen in a very long time. Kindness, real, unfiltered kindness. It was the last thing she saw before the world went black. Daniel Lawson hadn't planned to be on that side of town that night. He'd been coming from a late investor meeting, his mind occupied with foundation budgets and expansion plans. But when his driver slowed at the red light, he saw her. A young black woman, pregnant and drenched, leaning against a wall like the weight of the world was crushing her. He didn't think. He just acted. "Stop the car," he told his driver, his voice sharp with urgency. He grabbed the umbrella and stepped out into the storm. Up close, he could see the terror in her eyes, the way her body was trembling, not just from the cold, but from something deeper. "What's your name?" he asked gently, holding the umbrella over her. "Shayla," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. "Shayla, I'm Daniel. I'm going to help you." He helped her into the back seat, and the moment she sank into the leather, he saw the blood, dark and spreading against the pale fabric of her dress. His heart clenched. "To the hospital," he ordered his driver. Now, the drive was a blur of rain-streaked windows and shallow breathing. Daniel took off his suit jacket and draped it over her, a small gesture against the cold that had settled deep in her bones. He watched her, this stranger, and felt a fierce, protective anger rise in his chest. Someone had done this to her. Someone had left her out there to die, and he was going to make sure she lived. When they arrived at the hospital, Daniel carried her inside, shouting for help. Nurses rushed forward with a gurney, wheeling her away through a set of double doors. As they disappeared, her eyes fluttered open for just a moment, finding his. There was a silent question in them, a plea. "I'll be right here," he promised. "I'm not going anywhere." And he meant it. The hours that followed were agony. Daniel sat in the sterile waiting room, his suit still damp, his mind racing. He made calls, ensured she had the best doctors, the best care. He didn't know who she was, but he knew she deserved more than the cold street she'd been left on. Finally, a doctor emerged, his face grave. "Mr. Lawson, she's stable." But the exposure and stress induced premature labor. "We had to perform an emergency C-section." Daniel stood, his heart pounding. "And the baby?" The doctor's expression tightened. "A girl. She was born too early. Her lungs aren't fully developed. She's in the NICU. It's going to be a difficult fight." Daniel felt a profound sadness wash over him. A life so new, already fighting such a hard battle. He was allowed to see Shayla briefly. She was pale, hooked up to tubes and monitors, her face etched with pain even in sleep. He stood by her bedside for a long time, a silent guardian in the quiet room. When Shayla finally woke, the first thing she felt was an emptiness, a hollow, aching void where her baby had been. "My baby," she croaked, her throat raw. "Where is my baby?" A nurse touched her arm gently. "Your daughter is in the NICU, sweetheart. She's very small, but she's a fighter." The relief was so intense it made her dizzy, but it was quickly followed by crushing guilt. This was her fault. If she'd been stronger, if she hadn't been out in the rain. The days that followed were a blur of pain and fear. Shayla spent every moment she could by the incubator, watching her tiny daughter fight for every breath. She was so fragile, so impossibly small. Shayla named her Hope. It was a prayer and a promise. Daniel was a constant presence. He never intruded, but he was always there. He made sure she ate, that she had a place to rest. He spoke to the doctors with a calm authority that shielded her from the frightening medical terms. For a week it seemed hope was getting stronger. The doctors were cautiously optimistic. Shayla allowed herself to believe. She would sit by the incubator and whisper stories, promises of a safe and happy life far from the storms of the past. But one night, the machines began to beep frantically. Nurses rushed in. Shayla was pushed out, her heart hammering. She watched through the glass as doctors worked on her tiny daughter. The frantic beeping became a long, steady tone, a sound that cut through her soul like a knife. The doctors stopped. A nurse turned to her, her face a mask of sorrow. And in that moment, Shayla's world didn't just tilt. It shattered completely. Her baby, her hope, was gone. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just sank to the floor, the world dissolving into a blackness deeper than any storm she'd ever known. The collapse was total, a silent scream that echoed in the hollow chambers of her heart. The days after Hope's death were a void. Shayla moved through them like a ghost, her body present, but her soul adrift. Daniel arranged everything. The small, quiet funeral, attended only by him, Shayla, and his housekeeper, Miss Ruby. Shayla stood by the tiny grave, a single white rose in her trembling hand. She couldn't cry. The tears were frozen inside her, a solid block of ice in her chest. After the funeral, Daniel brought her to his home in Buckhead. He didn't ask where she wanted to go. He simply led her to a beautiful guest room overlooking a garden filled with magnolias and roses. "Rest, Shayla," he said gently. "Miss Ruby will look after you." And she did. Miss Ruby was a woman in her late 50s, with kind eyes and hands that knew exactly what was needed without words. She brought trays of food that Shayla didn't eat, cups of tea that grew cold, and fresh towels that went unused. She didn't pry or offer empty comfort. She was just there. Shayla spent most of her time in that room, staring out the window at the lush garden. She watched the birds, the flowers, the way sunlight filtered through the leaves, and felt profoundly disconnected from it all. How could the world be so beautiful when hers had ended? Sometimes she would hold the small, worn teddy bear she'd brought to the hospital. She'd press it to her face, searching for a trace of hope's scent. The sobs would come then, silent and racking, leaving her empty and exhausted. Daniel never pushed. He would leave books by her door, fresh flowers on the table. In the evenings he'd sit in the living room reading, the soft light of a lamp illuminating his face. He never asked her to join him, but his presence was a quiet invitation, a reassurance that she wasn't completely alone. One evening, Shayla found herself wandering the halls. She stopped outside a closed door, drawn to it for reasons she couldn't explain. She pushed it open gently. It was a child's room, pristine but empty. A small bed perfectly made, a rocking horse frozen in the corner, shelves lined with children's books, all covered in a thick layer of dust. The room had been sealed off from time itself. A wave of fresh grief hit her, so powerful it nearly brought her to her knees. She backed out, closing the door softly. Later that night, unable to sleep, she walked onto the balcony. Daniel was there, standing by the railing, looking out at the city lights. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to intrude." He nodded, his gaze still on the horizon. "That room was my son's," he said quietly. Shayla's breath caught. She hadn't known. "He passed away," Daniel continued, "a long time ago, with his mother." For the first time, Shayla understood the sadness in his eyes, the dust-covered room, the quiet way he carried himself. He wasn't just a kind stranger. He was a man who knew what it was to lose everything. In that shared, unspoken sorrow, a fragile bond began to form between them. Weeks turned into a month. Shayla's physical wounds healed, but the wound in her heart remained raw. The large house in Buckhead became her sanctuary. Slowly, tentatively, she began to venture out. She'd walk in the garden, the soft grass under her feet, anchoring her to the real world. She'd sit by the pool, watching the water ripple in the breeze. The house was run with quiet efficiency by Miss Ruby and a small staff. She felt their curious glances, but didn't care. Daniel continued to keep his distance, giving her space to grieve, but his quiet acts of care never stopped. One day she found a sketchbook and charcoal pencils on her table. There was no note, but she knew they were from him. She'd mentioned once in a rare conversation that she used to love to draw. She picked up a pencil, her fingers clumsy at first. She started sketching the flowers, the play of light on water. The drawings weren't very good, but the act of creating something was a small step toward feeling alive again. One afternoon, Miss Ruby found her in the kitchen, staring blankly at the stove. "You miss cooking?" the older woman said gently. Shayla nodded, a lump forming in her throat. "It's all I knew how to do for him." Miss Ruby placed a hand on her shoulder. "You cook for yourself now, child. You cook because it brings you peace." The next day, Shayla asked if she could help in the kitchen. They worked in comfortable silence, chopping vegetables, stirring pots. The familiar smells began to fill the emptiness inside her. Through Miss Ruby, Shayla learned more about Daniel, about his late wife, Michelle, and their son, Jordan, about the light that had gone out of the house when they were lost in a car accident. "He closed himself off after that," Miss Ruby said. "Poured everything into his work and his foundation. He helps so many people, but never lets anyone help him." She looked at Shayla then, a knowing look in her eyes. "He hasn't brought anyone into this house since that day." "Not until you." One evening, as Shayla sat sketching in the garden, Daniel came and sat beside her on the bench. He didn't speak for a long time, just watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" he said finally. Shayla nodded. "Michelle loved the sunsets here," he said softly. "She said it was like the world promising that no matter how dark the day, there would always be light again tomorrow." He turned to look at her, his eyes open and vulnerable. "I know it doesn't feel like it now, Shayla, but there will be light again for you too." She didn't believe him. Not yet. But sitting there in the quiet twilight with this man who understood her pain without needing her to speak it, she felt a tiny, fragile seed of hope begin to sprout in the barren landscape of her heart. The days began to fall into a gentle rhythm, but the peace was empty. She was healing, but she had no purpose. One morning, Daniel found her in the library, staring blankly at a wall of books. "I have to go to the foundation today," he said. "I was wondering if you'd like to come with me." Shayla was surprised. "The foundation?" "The Lawson Foundation," he confirmed. "I started it after Michelle and Jordan passed. We help women and children in difficult situations, single mothers, victims of abuse. We provide shelter, legal aid, job training." His words struck a chord deep inside her. A shelter for women in difficult situations. She thought of herself alone and terrified on that rainy street. "I don't know," she hesitated. "What would I do there?" "Nothing, if you don't want to," he said gently. "You can just see what we do." "But I thought it might be good to get out of the house." She agreed, more out of obligation than desire. But as they drove to the foundation in Midtown, she felt a flicker of curiosity. The Lawson Foundation wasn't a cold office. It was warm and welcoming, filled with bright colors and children's laughter. Women were learning to sew, use computers, manage finances. Shayla saw herself in every one of them. Daniel introduced her simply as Shayla, a friend. He showed her around, explaining the programs with a quiet passion. She ended up in the sewing classroom. The hum of machines was familiar and comforting. The instructor, a cheerful woman named Kaisha, welcomed her warmly. "Do you sew?" Kaisha asked. "I used to," Shayla replied. She sat at an empty machine, her fingers tracing the cool metal. She picked up fabric and began to sew. The simple, repetitive motion was meditative. The noise in her head began to fade. She spent the rest of the day there, helping other women, showing them how to thread a needle, how to stitch a straight seam. For the first time in months, she wasn't just Shayla the grieving mother or Shayla the charity case. She was Shayla the seamstress. She had a skill, a purpose. she could help. On the drive home, she was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. "Thank you, Daniel," she said as they pulled up to the house. He looked at her, a small smile on his lips. "For what?" "For today," she said. "For everything." That evening, for the first time, she joined him in the living room after dinner. They didn't talk much, but they sat in comfortable silence, reading. The empty house felt a little less empty. Shayla knew she was still broken, that a piece of her would always be missing. But for the first time since that terrible night, she felt like she might one day be whole again. The foundation had given her something she thought she'd lost forever, a reason to look toward tomorrow. Shayla began spending her days at the foundation. She found her place in the sewing room, her hands finding familiar rhythm, her mind finding quiet focus. She wasn't just teaching women to sew. She was listening to their stories, stories of pain and betrayal, but also of incredible resilience. In helping them stitch together pieces of fabric, she felt like she was stitching together the frayed edges of her own life. She started a project, teaching women to make beautiful bags from leftover fabric. The bags became popular, sold in a small shop, providing steady income. It was simple, but it was hers, and it worked.